Hi, students. This is Dr. Newmark. I promised that I would create a Katz supplement video. Not a cat video, but a Stephen Katz supplement video because we didn't have time to discuss it in class. Those of you who've taken an online class with me before will be used to how this video operates. I release these at the end of every week in an online graduate class, and they're my weekly highlights videos. But in this case, this supplement just concerns The Ethic of Expediency by Stephen Katz, and there's a little coda that has to do with something more recent that he's written. Okay, so I'm going to try to keep it under 10 minutes. We'll see if that's possible. Okay, so this is one of the epigraphs that Katz uses in The Ethic of Expediency. So this is by Cicero. So the stronger this faculty is, the more necessary it is for it to be combined with integrity and supreme wisdom. And if we bestow fluency of speech on persons devoid of those virtues, we shall not have made orders of them, but shall have put weapons into the hands of madmen. So if you think back to what the content of Stephen Katz's foundational article from 1992 was, what is the memo that he is discussing and what power is conveyed by the words used, the design of the document itself? How do we allow this messaging from the Cicero quote to the subtextual content from the memo to intersect with each other? What do we take away from that intersection? So let's think about this essay, the Katz essay, through the teaching of technical communication lens. So as a rhetorician, you can read this article and think about it as a very powerful example of this Cicero quote that you can put weapons in the hands of madmen. If you teach them the tools of persuasive communication, but they do not also have the sort of the wisdom or the equipment, of ethical reasoning, those two things put together, skills in persuasive communication and a platform with which to distribute that communication, that is very problematic and dangerous. That is a weapon, according to Cicero in this quote. So, but how do these terms that are used in this Katz article here and in the Cicero quote, communication, oratory, power, wisdom, and madmen, how do they relate to each other? They're very loaded terms, and Katz is just picking them up to be significatory at the beginning of this essay. They set the stage for something that he is going to bring forward at the beginning of the essay, but without really even telling us what it is or why he's presenting it to us, as if we should be able to decode that it is a representation of this very problematic, incendiary construct or potential persuasive move that is represented in the memo. Okay, so why might ethical catastrophes ensue when technical writing has as its focus expediency on technical criteria as a means to an end? So I didn't do this in this video or in this slide presentation, but I really encourage you to deconstruct the term expediency. Like, you can go to a dictionary definition and look it up and see what its history is, what its roots are, the incidences of this word throughout, English language usage. What does it mean, and why is he using that specific term, expediency, rather than something like efficiency? But expediency is meaning a particular thing here. So the writer of this memo from the Nazi regime, his name was Just, and Katz wonders, I wonder, how does the writer Just, how does his ethos reflect that of the organization? So this is a bureaucratic communication output, and it is a piece of organizational communication. It is workplace communication. That sounds very banal, and that indeed invokes Hannah Arendt's very famous work, The Banality of Evil. In fact, Stephen Katz refers to that in this essay, but it is basically on its face a very banal communication. It's efficient, it's effective, it's expedient in order to help the organization within which it emerges to carry forth their work, quote unquote, in a very expedient fashion. So when using either content from the Katz article directly in English 2210 or using the wisdom it imparts to guide your teaching of ethics, it is crucial that you help students understand what aspects of technical documents have established historically and in organizations to create authorial and institutional ethos. So how does this document convey organizational or institutional ethos? Is it so much that Yost himself as author establishes ethos or credibility, or is it the existence of that memo within a larger organizational superstructure that helps it to be invested with a certain kind of ethos and power? Okay, so let's discuss some grammatical and stylistic strategies, because those are the means by which persuasion happens. So if we look at these grammatical and stylistic strategies, we can see how they further obscure the fact that this memo is about human cargo. So it becomes very much suppressed that humans are the subject of this memo. Aside from the van being the subject. So the van that carries the humans becomes a sort of cipher as we analyze it, but on the face of it, the van is the subject. So I've underlined some lines here. So this is from the memo. It says, however, it has been observed that when the doors are shut, the load always presses hard against them as soon as darkness sets in. This is because the load naturally rushes toward the light when darkness sets in, which makes closing the doors difficult. So this is a description of how the load, which we know is human cargo headed for a concentration camp, is behaving within the van. So Katz extrapolates that an ethic of expediency can pervade many bureaucracies. And these are the contexts in which technical writing happens. So what is his warning then? So this is a really tricky thing, I think, when you're teaching this essay. And I wouldn't recommend teaching the whole thing in an undergraduate core curriculum course, English 2210. I actually would not recommend doing this. I think it's crucial, though, that you be equipped with the wisdom that an article like this imparts, because you can relate it, maybe not even referencing it directly, but you carry the knowledge forward and you apply it to other kinds of bureaucratic communication, other kinds of technical and professional communication that you see occurring within bureaucracies, within governments, within organizations, and within industries. So that's the move that you make. Now, you may choose to teach excerpts of this, but it's highly fraught. It can be very triggering and traumatizing for your students. So you need to make the decision about whether you're going to scaffold up to the inclusion of this with a certain goal in mind about how you're going to apply it in the teaching of ethical technical communication. But when we, as a group of graduate students and instructors, when we are looking at the rhetorical moves that happen in this paragraph, we can see the sort of like evasive moves, the dehumanizing rhetorical tactics that are used to actually just simply describe what is happening with the cargo in the van, because that was the purpose of Yost's memo. So what I wonder, and this is something that you could do, and this is what I've done in scholarship of my own, where I've used this Katz article to help support the arguments that I've been making, is can you think of obscurantist bureaucratic forms or reports or websites, etc., that you've encountered in your life and that you've perceived or experienced as having very ethical, like gray areas or very clearly problematic components within them? I have talked about medical reporting forms used within the Bureau of Indian Affairs in the late 19th and early 20th centuries as having some of the same sort of formal constraints that necessarily bracket out the human stories that would make the tragedies that occurred in Native American communities, indigenous agencies or reservations much more clear. But the design of the form made it very difficult for those stories to be told because they were efficient forms. They weren't designed for the stories to emerge within that colonialist context of Native American reservations in the early 20th century. So in my example, that's what I would think of, these obscurantist bureaucratic forms, but you might have some that you think of, and those are the kinds of things that you could share with your students. Okay, so Katz writes, technical writing, perhaps even more than other kinds of rhetorical discourse, always leads to action and thus impacts human life. He discusses deliberative rhetoric, so a type of rhetoric that is described by Aristotle that uses speech acts or written communication acts, in our case, to deliberate future courses of action. So I put an example up here on the screen of an environmental impact statement. This was from 2024, and it concerns the proposed modernization of the Bridge of the Americas land, port of entry in El Paso, Texas. So this is an environmental impact statement. You can find it online and you can read the whole thing. But this is a really good kind of very bureaucratic form that the writers of which were scientists, environmental policy experts, perhaps engineers. I don't have for you here the exact roster of people who collaborated on this, but professional writers did as well. And so within that organizational team, they had to conform to template requirements that are set forth by the General Services Administration. So they had to abide by certain things. So certain things are bracketed out and certain things are expected to be in it. So I'm hoping that you see the parallel. I'm certainly not saying that the General Services Administration in this case is analogous to the Nazi regime that made it possible for Just to write the memo that he did. There were lots of other cultural factors that made it possible for him to write the way that he did about human cargo. But the analogous move here is that within organizations there are certain expectations. So I don't want you to think that I'm overstating that parallel, but it is an important parallel for people to be able to recognize. Certainly it is a matter of degrees to which dehumanization or like environmental degradation takes place. But they do get communicated by professional writers within these bureaucratic, formally constrained outputs. Okay. Now, what dangers might emerge when technical communication outputs like a memo become, quote, technical instruments for carrying out organizational tasks, end quote. So Katz is writing from a standpoint as a US-based academic. Can you adapt this claim of his to your own standpoint, that should have said, and culture? Not all of you were raised in the US, and not all of you are, none of us, I don't think, are in a similar situation to Stephen Katz, although he wrote this article a very long time ago when I was probably a junior professor. And so he was just kind of beginning his academic career. Now he's an emeritus professor. So he's at a very different point in his life than a lot of us. But think about how his own sort of positionality informed what he was writing, and how your own cultural history and your own experience with the world around you and the bureaucracies that you've had to navigate have shaped your own view of these kinds of communication. So the telos or goal of life in the United States is economic progress. Is that the same as where you're from or the community in which you were raised? Could you apply that statement there as well? Now I have here up on the screen these consent pop-ups that UX writers wrote for Apple products. Here we have one that allows location to be turned on in the calendar, allow calendar to use your location. This other one concerns data and privacy. You could really decode the rhetorical moves in play in the writing of this kind of content. It happens within a certain organizational context, and it assumes a relationship between the user of this technology and the organization. But are there any ethical challenges that emerge as a result of this kind of communication relationship? I don't have time here. I've already gone over time, I'm sure. But if you read this data and privacy statement, I think you'd find it very interesting. And especially if you looked at it sort of through the prism of concerns that Katz raises. Again, a matter of degrees. This is not the same thing, but I'm asking you to use the tools that you're developing, the analytical frameworks that you're learning about, and apply it to these other things. So these are examples that I thought it could be applied to. So finally, so as a kind of coda, I wanted to refer you to something very recent that Katz wrote. And this is the last thing that I'll say. And I'll just read this because I wrote this in the book that Joe Bartolotta and I have written. So this is just directly pulled out of our book. So as a CODA, it is worth noting that in 2025, Katz has turned his attention to usability and human-machine interactions. So usability, Katz writes, focuses almost exclusively on the relation of the machine in the context of its environment and audience, in the hope that such information will lead to better engineering and design in the context of a larger market, as well as accepting culture. So today, as opposed to 1992, today Katz is worried that the further penetration of AI as a pervading manifestation of human-machine interaction will deliver TPW, that's the term he uses, technical and professional writing professionals, to a reality wherein usability figures as, quote, a system of technological enframing, end quote. And here he borrows from Heidegger. And in this enframing, transactional relations will dominate because everything, including writers and consumers, will dominate everything. And it will become something that exists to be available for the use by somebody else, for use by somebody else. So it's just this very exchange-based framework. And so he really pushes upon this term usability, especially as it applies to human-machine interaction through the larger lens of this AI-dominated landscape that we're clearly making our way through at this time. So this article by Katz is, I think, the last essay in Derek Ross's volume on ethics and technical communication, which just came out in 2025. So I encourage you to take a look at it if you haven't looked at that text yet. So on that note, I hope this was a pretty effective stand-in for the in-class conversation / lecture that we were going to have on Katz, but we didn't get to have. So now you've heard my 2 cents on the topic. Thanks.